Hello and welcome back to History for Today. Today I would like to do two things. I've got some more things to say about Sönke Ahrens' book, and I also would like to show how I actually take notes from books that I have highlighted in Kindle and transfer them to my reading notes in Rome. And so that will be the first thing that I will talk about. And basically, the nice thing about having a computer with a big screen is that I can run two apps side by side. And so I can highlight and take notes inside of my Kindle app and then transfer those over to Rome. Once I have the opportunity to move my highlights into Rome, this begins the process of paraphrasing, which I think is very important. I think is kind of a key point in the whole way that I am going to use the Rome app as a place for more permanent notes, for more my own insights about these things that I'm researching and reading and how I am planning on using them. So it's not going to be so much of a collecting point for highlights and for pieces of media that I want to retain access to. I'll use other apps for that. And Rome will be the place where I start to think about it and I start to develop my own thoughts and my own statements about these points that other people have made that I can then work into arguments and narratives and essays and other things that I want to produce. Now, things that I have been thinking about the book by Sönke Ahrens that I have been reading, how to take smart notes. I'm going to talk about the middle few chapters. Chapter 3, I've got to say, I love the anecdote at the beginning of that where the NASA project engineers spend all kinds of time and resources figuring out how to develop a zero-gravity ballpoint pen. The Soviets, on the other hand, just decide, well, we'll use a pencil. So, great story. Ahrens then lists out the 4 essential tools of this note-taking project, which are very basic. The first one is basically just a pencil and paper, or the digital equivalent of that. The second is a reference management system, which again, in its most basic form back in the day, we used to use index cards in a box for that as well. Now we use things like Zotero. The first step using whatever note system you're going to use is to capture fleeting notes about what you're reading. And Ahrens emphasizes again that these are not meant to be permanent, but they're just markers or bookmarks. The reference system then allows you to locate that information again, should you want to actually quote it. And also, of course, and very importantly, to be able to appropriately cite it. And then the slip box is where most of the actual work is done, while some type of an editor or a word processor on the back end is where you assemble the output. I had nothing really to say about Chapter 4, which was just kind of a few paragraphs. Chapter 5 begins with Ahrens addressing the sort of improper use of writing in assessments. Student essays that are designed to demonstrate their understanding of a topic, which is really a little bit misleading if the writing process is also the thinking process. A better way to teach this might be to really emphasize and focus on the students writing down their thoughts as they're reading, and then thinking more about these observations and assembling them into their own interpretations that they can then use to respond to essay prompts on exams or to write papers with. And if they do this, then the paper is almost kind of an afterthought, which I think is a legitimate student learning outcome. He says that studying doesn't really prepare students for research and writing, but instead is the research and writing, which I think is a very good way of putting that. If a student has done the process, assuming also that the instructor has been smart and hasn't based the grade on a set of random questions that amount to a little more than a trivia test, then this can be very successful. But this is an element of many courses, that some level of factual knowledge may actually be a legitimate learning outcome. Even so, it seems that from the data that Ahrens has assembled, that students retain facts better when these facts are part of a narrative or some type of an argument that they can follow. And that's easy enough to do, obviously, in history. So I will continue to focus on that. Ahrens talks a lot in this chapter about focusing on the writing in a way that actually kind of seems like it's a response to something. And I feel like I've heard half of an argument and I don't really understand what he's responding to here. So maybe it's a little bit less compelling and effective for me. I do think that this relates a little bit to what I call reading like a grad student, where you look for the author's argument in the introduction and in the conclusion, and then you trace the development of that argument, mostly by examining the topic sentences of paragraphs. So you get in the habit of finding topic sentences and using those and stringing those together to see how the argument holds up. Ahrens actually concludes this chapter with the statement in italics that nothing counts other than the writing. In the beginning of chapter 6, Ahrens uses the story of Malcolm McLean's development of the shipping container in the 1950s as a metaphor for the slipbox. This is a good story. I use this story in my environmental history class as well. Although I do think that he maybe goes a little bit overboard in his analysis of the psychology of the other people in the shipping industry who failed to make this innovative leap. I'm not a psychologist, but I don't think that that's exactly the way the history worked in this case. The important point seems to be that the slipbox becomes more valuable as it grows. It's the opposite of really the type of research where you store things in a very particular place and then can only find things that you've already deliberately set up in particular positions and relationships. This also reminds me of Douglas Adams's famous character, Dirk Gently, and what he had to say about looking for things, which actually I just wasted about a half hour trying to find the particular quote that I was looking for and wasn't able to. But Dirk Gently's point is that if you go out into the world looking for something particular, there are so many things in the world that it will be very difficult to find it. But if you go out into the world looking for anything that might be helpful to you, you're very likely to find something because there are so many things in the world. So how's that for paraphrasing? The slipbox is designed to be a safe place for ideas, so you can forget them until you need them. Fleeting notes, Ahrens says, are kind of trivial and can be taken very casually since they're really not going to live beyond the point where these ideas are carried into and incorporated into some type of permanent note. The permanent notes should be standardized and should be stored together so that they will be useful in a variety of different circumstances. Ahrens makes a point of separating these types of notes so that the slipbox can achieve some type of critical mass. He also makes the point that it makes sense to revisit these notes that you've taken to see if they still make sense or if they still matter to you. And I think I will plan on doing this a couple of times. First, at the end of reading a text, which is the moment where I change the fleeting notes into reading notes. And then at the end of that process where I turn my reading notes into permanent notes. Probably makes sense to review them a couple weeks later to see if I see things or connections that I didn't when I was just finishing the reading. Oftentimes I get excited about an author's point of view, probably less so than I used to when I was younger and had less context. But it's good to get a little bit of distance from a text and then go back to it and see if what you initially thought about it still holds true. Fleeting notes are for capturing ideas when you're busy doing something else as well. And so I've been thinking about apps that might aid me in doing this. Things like Drafts or Air. I really like Walling for storing videos and then making notes on them. And then, of course, Kindle and Instapaper both have the capability of highlighting and allowing those highlights to be transferred. And then most importantly, permanent notes should be written in a way, Ahrens says, that allows you to understand them even if you've completely forgotten about their original context. These notes need to be very self-contained since a lot of their value is going to depend on connections to other ideas that you haven't even had yet. So they have to be something that you recognize the meaning of, even if you've forgotten the context. And in a sense, that's one of the things that makes these ideas permanent, is that they have some type of life outside of the particular context that you originally found them in. So those are my thoughts for today about the way that I'm working with Rome and also the reading that we're doing together in the Rome reading group on this text. I hope people found that interesting. Thanks for listening. I'll see you again next time.